Let's just be very clear about what's just happened, because this completely destroys a lie which frankly should never, ever, ever have been indulged in the first place. But clearly, in the world in which we live, horror has to be spelled out in primary colours before it's widely believed. 3 Israeli hostages in Gaza, they're shirtless. That's an important detail. It means you cannot be mistaken for, say, a suicide bomber or someone attempting to conceal their weapons. They were waving a white flag of surrender, which they had crafted themselves by attaching some white fabric to a stick. According to an IDF investigation, for some reason, a soldier felt threatened, yelled terrorists, and opened fire on the 3 Israeli hostages, shooting 2 of them to the ground. The third then fled. The soldier told his commanding officer he'd encountered Hamas militants. An IDF squad followed, according to this account, the third hostage, who managed to flee into a hiding place inside a building. The soldiers approached the building and began to hear shouts in Hebrew asking for help. The hostage, hiding inside the building, came out and ran inside again. The soldiers then say they believed it was a Hamas member trying to pull them into a trap, so they entered into the building and they shot this unarmed, clearly, hostage, who posed no threat, dead. They then retrieved these 3 bodies. Notice what they described as identifying marks that raised a suspicion they were hostages who managed to escape, and indeed then discovered they were, in fact, 3 Israeli hostages taken by Hamas. What matters in this current incident is 2 things. Firstly, to feel compassion, sadness for the grieving loved ones of these young men whose lives were taken completely unnecessarily. Secondly, if obviously unarmed, shirtless Israeli hostages, waving a white flag, yelling in Hebrew, are being shot dead as they flee by the Israeli Defense Forces, what hope is there for Palestinian civilians? It should already have been clear, despite the lies, that Israel has unleashed an indiscriminate onslaught against the Palestinian people. The gaslighting is off the scale. We can see with our own eyes what has happened. This week, Joe Biden declared that Israel was losing support over its indiscriminate bombing. He used that term, indiscriminate bombing. Odd, because the US has not been calling this bombing indiscriminate, as it has given Israel a blank check to engage in a mass slaughter in Gaza for 10 weeks. This isn't a criticism of Israel by Biden. In actual fact, it's a confession of US complicity in a grave, grave crime, and Joe Biden will be damned for history for what he's done. Now, the BBC are reporting that the IDF mistakenly killed them. They use the term mistakenly. That's a travesty of reporting. They were deliberately shot. These soldiers were not shooting at something else, then accidentally killed these 3 men. They deliberately chose to kill 3 men who were clearly unarmed, who clearly posed no threat. No one thinks they tried to kill what they thought were hostages, but we know they killed unarmed men, defenseless, who posed no threat. Now, these 3 tragically killed hostages are international news. Well, what's happening to those who the Israeli army are shooting dead who aren't Israeli hostages, but who are also clearly unarmed Palestinian civilians who pose no threat? They're clearly being killed by the IDF in huge numbers, by bombs and bullets, and we'll come on to that. Now, we are told that these IDF soldiers were not following the correct rules of engagement. Now, sometimes there's a need to speak plainly, and I think this is one of them. So let's call that excuse for what it is. Total bollocks. As the former IDF combat soldier Ariel Bernstein, who fought in Gaza in 2014, he now campaigns for peace, I posted my own interview with him yesterday. Listen to what he wrote today about these claims. A complete lie. He says the instructions were, when he was in Gaza, to shoot for anyone who remains in the area where we are fighting as a legitimate target. He says there is no doubt, no doubt. You can say it's necessary. He says it's not. You can say that's how wars are won. I doubt it, but you shouldn't lie. These are the instructions for opening fire in Gaza. Anyone who is in the combat zone is a terrorist. It is abundantly clear what's happened. The IDF treat anyone in northern Gaza as a legitimate target. Now, we also know from a Human Rights Watch report from 2009, following a previous Israeli attack in Gaza, Operation Cast Lead, that Israeli troops have a track record of shooting at innocent civilians waving white flags. I'll read one. In one case documented in the report, on January the 7th, in eastern Jabalia, 2 women and 3 children from the Abd Rabo family were standing for a few minutes outside their home, at least 3 of them holding pieces of white cloth, when an Israeli soldier opened fire, killing 2 girls, aged 2 and 7, and wounding the grandmother and 3rd girl. We spent 7 to 9 minutes waving the flags, and our faces were looking at them, as in the soldiers, said the girl's grandmother, who was shot twice, and suddenly they opened fire and the girls fell to the ground. Now, look, apologists for Israel really have their work cut out right now, given the scale of atrocity and the blatant war crimes. According to Israel Hayom, an Israeli newspaper, which is close to the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Their targeting appeared to be terrorists, the hostages, because there were no good visuals on them and they could have been wearing clothes that made them appear as locals. What does this mean? Other than the Israeli hostages looked like they could have been Palestinian civilians and that's why armed forces shot them dead. According to Yair Rosenberg of The Atlantic, the reason this happens is because Hamas fighters dress in civilian clothes, which is a war crime, because it makes it extremely difficult to distinguish between civilians and combatants. The death of civilians, as a result, is by design. Oh yeah, of course, yeah, sure. The IDF shooting dead, clearly unarmed, surrendering men who pose no threat, that's Hamas's fault. Let's be clear, it's Israel indiscriminately firing on civilians as part of an illegal strategy of collective punishment that is responsible here. Israel has just set fire to the Geneva Conventions. They're not bothering to abide by any of it. And
we're standing up for our interests and values, not shrinking back. Not in the face of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Not in the face of an intensifying strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific and around the world.
If the witness will suspend, and I ask that everyone again respect this hearing, we will suspend until the room is cleared.
Our diplomacy, our development must work hand in hand.
Committee will suspend. And again, I appreciate that people feel passionately about these issues. I would ask that you respect our witnesses and our committee members and allow the American people to hear their testimony.
Come on, I'm an Army colonel, I'm a former diplomat, I resigned on that war in Iraq that you talked about. That was a terrible thing, and what we're doing right now in supporting Israel's genocide